Don't worry, Zendaya. My white skin will protect us. Pew 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 pew. Action sequence, cool battle scene, long slow-paced sequence about how everything about a said religious prophecy was engineered by humans, scene with space witches doing cool girly get-togethers to plan the impending doom of a space empire. Pew 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 pew. I mean, hear me out. So, as you might have guessed from the thumbnail, I will be talking about Dune today. I'd like to preface this video by saying that this is one of my all-time favorite series and one of my all-time favorite books. So needless to say, it is going to be hard for me to be impartial and unbiased. Although I will share my personal thoughts and commentary about Dune, this video will also delve more into Frank Herbert, the author's inspirations for writing Dune, some of the controversies surrounding Dune, and finally why Dune is still a very misunderstood story. So let's get right into it, shall we? In Dune, Paul Atreides, the heir to the House of Atreides, moves with his family to the desert planet Arrakis, the only source of the valuable spice melange, which grants extended life and heightened awareness. Betrayed by their rivals, House Harkonnen, Paul's family is nearly wiped out and is forced to flee into the desert, where he takes refuge with the Fremen, the planet's indigenous people. As he learns their ways, he begins to fulfill a prophecy of a Messianic leader, gaining immense power. However, as Paul rises to become the ruler of Arrakis, he grapples with visions of a galaxy-spanning war fought in his name, realizing that his ascension may come at a terrible cost. Sounds like your very usual premise. But there's a reason why Dune shines in a pile of other very cookie-cutter, mediocre sci-fi fantasy stories. The thing that I personally believe sets Dune apart is actually how grounded its themes are in real life, which kind of forces the audience to take it more seriously, even though there are people riding giant worms in the desert. Yes, Dune has a whole lot of battle and action sequences, but these sequences are balanced by very slow-paced scenes discussing themes of power, religion, ecology, nature, philosophy, and so much more. While some might really enjoy these slow-paced discussions about the themes mentioned, for a great majority, the slow pace may be the downfall of the book, as to some people, it might give them the satisfaction equivalent of watching paint dry. If you're one of those people who think like, yawn, boring, I'm not going to read this 896-page book when there are already multiple movies about it out there. And that's totally within your right. But then, I must say, it is all the more easier to walk away from the said movies, thinking, oh my god, another white savior movie, it's anti-Muslim, it's racist, it's sexist. And while I think some of these criticisms are valid, I still think that a lot of these criticisms are made because they miss the entire point of Dune. Although I think both Dune Part 1 and Part 2 are great adaptations of the book, and I've personally really enjoyed them, with every book to big screen adaptation, there is no possible way that all the nuances and details in a book will be fit into a movie. A lot of this criticism comes from the fact that Dune is taken at face value, and its subtext rarely talked about. And oh my god, subtext is everywhere within this book. And if you don't know what the word subtext means, don't worry. It is just a fancy way of saying an underlying or distinct theme in a piece of writing or conversation. So let's get into these very important themes and messaging that we can extrapolate from Dune and discuss why they're important. Dune critiques the idea of a hero's journey by showing how a messianic figure like Paul Atreides, despite his noble intentions, can become a dangerous ruler. The novel warns against blindly following charismatic leaders, as their rise often leads to fanaticism, war, and destruction. Paul himself foresees the devastating jihad that will be carried out in his name, yet he is powerless to stop it. Wait a minute. Dune is actually a white saviorism story. What makes you say that? Well, because he saves these Muslim/Arab-coded desert people. I guess it is important to start with the most popular criticism that Dune gets, since this issue is at the crux of the novel. A lot of people will comment on Dune and say that it's a white savior story, since it is about what is described as a white-coded main character, who ends up joining and then later leading a Muslim or an Arab-coded people. So this must mean Dune equals Avatar, got the white savior stamp, worthless piece of trash media. I'd say let's dig in a little deeper. From the beginning of Dune, it is very explicit explicitly explain that the prophecy the Fremen believe in of the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, is artificially engineered by the Bene Gesserit, who've come to Arrakis before to very purposefully place those superstitions and beliefs. Even Paul, who has the sort of god or deity-like power of prescience, was specifically bred as a result of a years-long eugenics project to produce an offspring that has that very specific, highly coveted power. So needless to say, nothing about Paul is the result of prophecy. Nothing about him makes him a randomly chosen person for greater purposes. He and the prophecies about him are the products of human intervention and engineering, mostly performed by the Bene Gesserit. One of the Bene Gesserit's goals is to plant myths among different cultures to shape belief systems that can later be exploited. And that's what Paul eventually ends up doing, exploiting the Fremen, who are tied to him and his prophecy, as if they're almost entranced because of the fake news Wattpad-ass prophecies. Paul might have a part in him that generally wants to help these people, but he's also very obviously motivated by the revenge for the destruction of House Atreides. While Paul starts the story on the fence, letting the Fremen know, hey guys, I know you believe I'm the Messiah and all of that, but I'm just the regular schmegler guy who can maybe sometimes see into the future, but don't let that scare you since this was all planned. Paul is very reluctant at the beginning to play into the prophecies and beliefs of the Fremen, but he realizes in time that these beliefs can inherently be used to his advantage. So Paul ultimately uses these myths to his benefit, showing how leaders can co-opt religion for political gain, even when they claim to be acting on people's best interest. The Fremen believe that they will be saved if they follow Paul, as long as he's the mythologized figure, but even so, a lot of people die because they follow him and his so-called holy war. Paul promises the Fremen of a green paradise, referring to the Fremen dream, which is to terraform Arrakis into a lush green paradise. He pays lip service to Liet Kynes' ecological plan and uses it politically to strengthen his relationship with the Fremen. Paul never implements a large-scale terraforming. He doesn't redirect imperial resources toward greening Arrakis. He doesn't take legislative, military, or scientific action to prioritize ecological transformation. He is well aware that a green Arrakis would destroy the spice cycle, which is antithetical to the power he just gained. So while Paul publicly supports this dream, his real priorities lie elsewhere. Paul never had intentions to terraform Arrakis into a green paradise. He just supports the dream of a greening Arrakis and uses it as a tool to earn the Fremen's trust and loyalty. So in short, Dune is not a white savior story, because Paul was never meant to be a savior. But as I will shortly see in the comments, this stance is known to get a lot of pushback. For example, in this article written by Ern Ashkenazi, states that it does not matter if Frank Herbert tried to subvert the trope of white saviorism, since at the end of the day, Paul is still a very charismatic and capable leader and a textbook hero. So everything he does eventually play into the trope that he was trying to subvert. What do you mean he's supposed to be a villain? It's not a subversion because he was still so heroic throughout the entire book. What do you mean he didn't strangle puppies and drank baby blood in his free time? If he doesn't do super obviously villainous things, how are we, as the audience, be able to tell that he's a villain? While I understand this argument, as you can tell, I find it a little weak. Subversions, as the name suggests, are not meant to be super obvious and in your face, and it makes all the more sense that for the most part, Paul isn't viewed as a complete villain. It's true that he's heroic and that he's a capable and charismatic ruler, but so are a lot of leaders from past and present history who are famous for leading people into their doom. While I think about the polarization of the Dune fanbase, while some arguing that Paul is a hero and a good guy, and others arguing that he actually used the Fremen for his own selfish purposes, I'm even more convinced about how successfully Frank Herbert was able to construct a realistic, charismatic leader. Because realistically, a lot of people are blinded by the charisma and the almost performative heroism a lot of leaders display and have displayed throughout history. The public is eager to get carried away in political enchantment because they only see the good side of a said leader. People tend to focus on a leader's good looks, their public speaking skills, or even the way these leaders carry themselves in public, rather than looking closer at their ugly sides. It is in the great interest of a political leader or figure to be seen exactly the way Paul is perceived by the Fremen. I'm sure you can name me a world leader or a politician or two that you absolutely despise. Know that they're involved in very sketchy practices, sketchy organizations, and sketchy people, yet they're still loved, nay, almost worshipped by a large number of people who willingly ignore these factors. characters. And like a lot of good stories that attempt to deal with more morally complex characters, you will find that the lines of good and evil are not always so clear-cut, and that is what makes these characters more interesting. While we as human beings like to think that we're all good, Paul's character and his portrayal as a leader is much more in line with what an actual human being is like. Paul is someone who starts out with the best of intentions, makes mistakes, exploits and manipulates people, and at the end is powerless to stop the mass destruction he started. There are a lot of charismatic world leaders with a lot of dirty laundry, but a lot of people wouldn't straight up call them irredeemable villains. Some people, while being fully aware of the said leader's dirty laundry, will still have an emotional or almost religious devotion to them, ignoring all their perceived bad deeds. And because of this, some of these leaders will continue to be elected and kept in power, even if it's sometimes at the public's detriment. And on the bottom line, that is the point of Dune, to show us that the idea of an all-good hero can be dangerous to believe in. A passage from the book where the character of Liet Kynes has a hallucinatory talk with his deceased father as he's dying in the desert states. Arrakis is a one-crop planet. One crop. It supports a ruling class that lives as ruling classes have lived in all times, while beneath them, a semi-human mass of semi-slaves exists on the leavings. No more terrible disaster could befall your people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero. Maybe you can argue here that Paul actually fought beside the Fremen to help them get free of Harkonnen domination, as his own house was destroyed by the Harkonnens as well. So Paul and the Fremen made natural allies. And I agree with this to some point, as this is how things have started. But Paul doesn't just fight with the Fremen. He ends up taking charge of them, telling them what to do. And the Fremen quickly concede and give away all their control to Paul, not because they're weak, not because they're less capable than Paul, but because they're blinded by faith, the faith they have in him, only for Paul to lead most of them into their doom. Since Paul has the power of prescience and can glimpse at moments into the future, he knows that if he decides to go on a holy war or a jihad, a lot of Fremen will die. While knowing this, he chooses to do this anyways. If you're still not convinced that this is not a white savior story, I'll share another interesting insight. Since the fact that Paul actually exploited the Fremen was up for major debate in the books, while adapting the movies, Denis Villeneuve decided to make significant changes to the character of Chani, portrayed by Zendaya in the movies. Although Chani is also very capable and badass in the books, when Paul decides to lead the jihad and ends up leaving her for Princess Irulan, she's very chill about it. The best way I can describe her in the books is that she is a Paul fangirl. She's like, Paul can do no wrong, I will follow him blindly, I will follow this man through his rights and wrongs. And as Paul's power grows in the second half of Dune, her character sort of fades away in the book. But if you watch the movies, you will notice that Chani's character is fundamentally different than in the books. From the moment she meets Paul, she's very skeptical of the so-called prophecies, and it is not just her that displays this skepticism. There's a whole subgroup of very skeptical Fremen who do not believe in the prophecies, as they correctly predict that the prophecies are there to further control and enslave their people. She can see through the lies and the machinations of the Bene Gesserit, and Denis Villeneuve has explained in an interview that the reason he made this change in Chani's character was to really hammer in the point that Paul isn't really that good of a guy.
The character of Shani in the movie is different from the character in the book. She's someone that don't believe in what Paul represents, which is very different from the book. The idea was to create a distance with Paul and to understand that he went through, he took the wrong door, and to make sure that the movie will be a cautionary tale against Messianic figure and not a celebration of Paul.
That is why Chani, someone who is romantically involved with Paul, is so against him after Paul decided to go ahead with his holy war, because she knows that he's using the power of prophecy to essentially control her people. While I'm trying to film this video, Mojo has not been a very good boy. Why won't you let me film this, Mojo? Herbert explores how religious narratives can be engineered for control. The Bene Gesserit, a society of highly skilled women, plant myths among different cultures to shape belief systems that can later be exploited. Paul ultimately uses these myths to consolidate power. This theme is something that feels very close to me as someone growing up in a country like Turkey. I've personally seen how religion was used as a political pawn by a lot of prominent leaders to gain political favor. And after reading Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, I learned that in some places places like Iran, the political power of religion was even more all-encompassing, especially after the Islamic Revolution. But the Islamic Revolution in Iran didn't start as a religious movement per se. It was born out of widespread frustration, inequality, and political repression, similar to the plot of Dune, where the Fremen are very frustrated over the constant Harkonnen interference in extraction of their spice. From 1941 to 1979, Iran was ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a Western-backed monarch. While he pushed for rapid modernization, including land reforms, women's rights, and industrialization, it mostly benefited the elite and ignored or harmed the working class and the religious poor. The Shah also cracked down hard on dissent. Opposition was imprisoned or executed. So for many people, life under the Shah felt unjust, undemocratic, and dehumanizing. Khomeini was a charismatic cleric who tapped into the people's anger, especially by blaming the Shah for selling out Iran's resources to the West, especially the US and Britain. He framed the revolution not just as political, but as moral and spiritual, a return to justice, dignity, and Islamic values after years of Western corruption. For poor, devout Iranians, especially those ignored by the Shah's modernizing reforms, this message resonated deeply. Many people didn't expect the Islamic Republic to be so extreme. They just wanted the Shah gone. Even secular revolutionaries supported Khomeini at the time, thinking they'd get a democratic government after the revolution. But once the Shah fell, Khomeini's group moved fast, consolidating power, rewriting the constitution, and purging opponents. What started as a broad revolution became a theocratic regime, and by then, it was too late for many to push back. The parallels between Dune and the Islamic Revolution are actually pretty striking, especially when you look at the deeper themes of charismatic leadership, religious manipulation, revolution, and power consolidation. Both the Islamic Revolution and Dune's plot has a charismatic leader rising from exile. Paul Atreides becomes a mythic messianic figure after fleeing into the desert. He's seen as a liberator by the Fremen, who believe in a prophecy that he fulfills. Similarly, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile as a spiritual and political savior, fulfilling many people's hopes for justice after the Shah's repression. Both Paul and Khomeini use religion as a political tool. In both cases, religion is not just a belief system, it's a powerful, organizing, and manipulative force. In both the plot of Dune and in the Islamic Revolution, revolution comes with unexpected consequences. The Fremen revolution against the Harkonnens and the Emperor starts as a fight for justice and autonomy, but under Paul, it turns into a violent jihad across the galaxy. The Iranian Revolution similarly started as a people's movement against tyranny, but it ended in religious authoritarianism, executions, and loss of freedoms. Paul becomes more than human. His followers deify him, even though he himself fears the consequences of their blind devotion. Khomeini was similarly idolized to the point where questioning his decisions became taboo, and his image was used to legitimize strict state control. Both leaders became symbols larger than themselves, and that symbolic power helped cement real-world domination. And while the Islamic Revolution happened years after Dune was published, it is important to also take note of parts of history where Herbert was actually inspired while writing Dune. The character of Paul Atreides has parallels to T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, who united Arab tribes during World War I. Lawrence was a British intelligence officer stationed in the Middle East. Britain promised Arab independence in return of their help against the Ottomans. Lawrence, who had a deep understanding of the Arab culture and language, became a key liaison between the British forces and the Arab rebels. He lived among the Bedouin tribes, earning their respect and playing a vital role in the organizing guerrilla warfare and sabotage tactics against the Ottomans. Lawrence became seen by many Arabs and portrayed by the British as a kind of liberator or prophet-like figure, helping unite the tribes for a noble cause. This image was fueled by both British propaganda and later by Lawrence's own writings, especially Seven Pillars of Wisdom. He later expressed guilt and inner conflict, knowing that the British had no intention of truly granting Arab independence. In both cases, a foreign figure becomes a myth, and rebellion becomes a tool of larger powers, British imperialism in Lawrence's case, and the Atreides or Bene Gesserit in Dune. Herbert said that he wrote Dune as a cautionary tale about heroes. So while Dune is science fiction, and all these events that I talked about are history, all these stories ask the same chilling question. What happens when the revolution succeeds, but the people still aren't free? And for people who are going to be saying stuff like, this bad stuff only happens in Islamic countries, not in my country, here in the West, where everything is good and dandy, where we are certainly not susceptible to being manipulated by religious or charismatic leaders. I'm sad to say that Islamic countries aren't the only places where people are susceptible to being entranced by leaders and politicians posing as messianic figures. In the 16th century, Martin Luther protested the Catholic Church's corruption, sparking a religious movement that tore apart Europe and led to the creation of Protestantism. The movement similarly started as a call for reform, but ended up becoming a massive religious and political power shift. Luther didn't intend to start a war, like Paul, but his ideas were used to justify violence, suppression, and new systems of control. Different rulers used Protestantism to gain independence from the Pope and solidify their own power, much like Paul in Dune and Khomeini in Iran. The English rose up against King Charles I, who was seen as abusing power, and the monarchy was overthrown. Oliver Cromwell took over as Lord Protector and ruled under strict Puritan Christian law. Similar to the other historical events I've mentioned, revolution was supposed to bring freedom. However, this change led to strict religious authoritarianism. Cromwell banned theater, dancing, celebrations, and Catholic worship, and used religion and moral purity to justify censorship, violence, and control. People fight a tyrant, only to be ruled by a stricter, religious-based system, eerily similar to the Fremen exchanging the Harkonnens for Paul's jihad. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, a series of religious wars were launched by Christian Europe to reclaim the Holy Land. The leaders promised glory, salvation, and divine favor for those who joined, just like Paul's Fremen followers in Dune, or Iranian revolutionaries believing in martyrdom. But the Crusades led to centuries of bloodshed, often with mixed political, economic, and religious motives. Similar to the plot of Dune, a holy war was justified by religion, carried out with imperialistic goals, exactly what Paul fears his rule would unleash. So now, I can rest in bed peacefully, knowing that, because I gave these examples, no one can be commenting things like, oh, but this only happens in Islamic countries, not here in the West. The desert planet of Arrakis is a metaphor for Earth's fragile ecosystems and the real-world consequences of exploiting natural resources. Herbert's initial inspiration came from his research on the Oregon dunes in the late 1950s. He intended to write an article titled "They Stopped the Moving Sands," focusing on efforts to stabilize the sand dunes using poverty grass. Although the article was never completed, this research sparked his interest in ecology and desert environments, leading to the creation of the desert planet Arrakis. I mean, come on. A planet is colonized because of its very highly coveted resource that can not only prolong lifespans but can also power interstellar space travel. I feel like Herbert was trying to allude to something. Something like freedom.
High resolution.
Herbert emphasizes how human survival is tied to environmental balance, and how resource scarcity leads to conflict and imperialism. The struggle for Arrakis mirrors historical and contemporary colonial conflicts. The Fremen represent an oppressed indigenous group, whose land, Arrakis, is exploited by external powers, like the Empire and the Harkonnens, for its valuable spice. Paul's leadership over the Fremen is complex. While he helps them overthrow their oppressors, he also uses them for his own purposes, raising questions about the role of so-called liberators in colonial struggles. For example, when France colonized Algeria in 1830 and ruled it for over 130 years, indigenous Algerians were exploited, repressed, and denied citizenship. Groups like FLN led a brutal guerrilla war for independence, resulting in over 1 million deaths. The indigenous Algerians, similar to the Fremen in Dune, were spiritual, tough, desert-adapted people, and France, similar to the Empire and the Harkonnens, wanted colonial powers and were interested only in resources. And very similarly, as the US expanded westward in the 19th century, Native American tribes were forcibly removed, massacred, or assimilated. Their land was seized for settlement, agriculture, and resource extraction. The Fremen, similar to the Native Americans, who were deeply connected to the land with knowledge of survival outsiders didn't have, resisted the colonizers. Paul, while he's sometimes seen as a sympathetic figure, still acts within colonial frameworks. So now that I've talked about the main themes of Dune, let's talk about some of the controversies surrounding Dune. Although I've already talked about the white saviorism trope, this does not seem to be the only reason why Dune is regarded as controversial. While Dune is ahead of its time in many aspects, it is a work of its time. And although I think Frank Herbert was a great author with an insanely vivid imagination and an uncanny skill for world building, know that I'm not trying to excuse him of anything, especially after learning about the very tense relationship he had with his son, Brian Herbert, and the reasons surrounding why. Middle Eastern and Islamic culture. The Fremen culture in Dune draws heavily from Middle Eastern traditions. The terms like Mahdi, Jihad, and Siege are borrowed from Arabic, reflecting Islamic concepts. This incorporation highlights Herbert's exploration of how desert environments influence cultural and religious practices. Dune receives a lot of backlash, especially in its movie adaptations, because while the culture and appearance of the Fremen are inspired from Middle Eastern or Islamic cultures, the actors who portray them are not even part of the said cultures or even from similar geographies. According to this NBC News article about the appropriation of Islamic and Middle Eastern cultures in Dune, it's an erasure, says Serena Rasool, a casting director and founder of Muslim American Casting. You don't cast MENA or Muslim actors, yet you profit off of their culture. That's where it's painful for us as creatives. It means that we're not good enough to be part of the film. Ali Karju Reveri, assistant professor in Islamic studies at Bucknell University, says, the image of an Arab-ish crowd or veiled wailing woman, not to mention when it's injected with violence, has a history that is steeped in the dehumanization of entire peoples. I do agree that more people from Middle Eastern or Islamic backgrounds should be casted in these roles, because while I was watching Dune Part 2, guys, and Zendaya's character as Chani referred to Paul with his given tribe name, Usul, as Usul, the way she pronounced it, guys, I couldn't help, I giggled, I kind of like chuckled in the theater because I'm like, oh my god, I cannot take this seriously. The way she's pronouncing it sounds so Americanized. Zendaya is a great actor. I'm not saying anything about her acting skills. She clearly has a lot of passion and devotion to this role, but my god, get a speech dialect coach or something, because that's not how that word is pronounced, my friend. It's not pronounced as usul. The second comment about the dehumanization of these people don't sit entirely right with me. See, I'm not a professor in Islamic studies. Neither am I an Arabic person. Neither have I lived in any tribal desert community. But as someone who was raised in Islamic culture, in my entirely subjective personal opinion, the inclusion of Islamic and Middle Eastern cultures, for the most part, in Dune is pretty tasteful and well done. No one is called exotic for once in this series, which is something I wish I could say was never used to describe me when I came to Canada, especially within the book. It is clear that the Fremen are highly capable people who don't need saving. Even Paul's father, Duke Leto, remarks that the way to ruling Arrakis is through the Fremen, as they have desert power, meaning that the Fremen are so capable that they can cross terrains that no one ever can, and hence why they have to earn the trust of the Fremen, as these people are the true inhabitants of the land. The people of Arrakis are one with the desert. Their language, their culture, their customs, and even the technology they use is reflective of that. While the obvious villains such as the Harkonnens dismiss them as rabble or sand dwellers, Duke Leto, Paul, and Gurney quickly come to understand and appreciate their culture and their ability to thrive in extreme conditions, which is a direct contrast to the complacent and wasteful nobility of the Imperium. It is clear in the book that the Fremen culture is deeply practical, and their customs such as water discipline and sandword writing are not presented as mystical oddities, but as logical adaptations to the environmental conditions of Arrakis. Rather than being exoticized, the Fremen serves as a commentary on resilience and environmental adaptation. And thankfully, Rossol acknowledged that Dune is a complex work that doesn't fall completely into Orientalist tropes. She also nodded to some diversity in the cast, which features Black and Asian characters in few prominent roles. Personally, it is refreshing to see something in pop culture that is in some way reminiscent to the culture that I grew up in, and I appreciate that. Sexism. Guys, come on. I've been understanding to the criticisms up until this point, but sexism as a criticism in Dune is simply one that I cannot accept. If you watch any of my previous videos, you will know that I will yap about sexism and the plight of women all day long. Out of all the things this series, this story could be critiqued about, sexism is not one of those things, guys. Oh, the Bene Gesserit are portrayed to be manipulative, so the story is trying to say that all women are scheming manipulators. I would personally sacrifice my firstborn without a thought to be a Bene Gesserit witch, because the way they're described in the Dune universe, they're a highly capable bunch. So capable, in fact, that, the Padishah Emperor, the guy who controls the space empire, takes counsel from the said woman. Bene Gesserit, according to the book, are an ancient all-female order of political, religious, and scientific manipulators. They operate behind the scenes of the galactic empire, pulling strings, guiding bloodlines, shaping politics, and preserving knowledge. They've existed for thousands of years, with one major long-term goal: creating the Kwisatz Haderach, a super being who can see into both male and female ancestral memories, and possibly into the future, something no Bene Gesserit can fully do. Their powers are insane. Not in like a flashy Marvel superhero kind of way, but in a terrifyingly cerebral and strategic kind of way. With total control over their nervous system and muscles, a Bene Gesserit can slow her heartbeat, control pain, and even kill with a single strike. Oh, also, did I mention that they can change the sex of their baby while they're pregnant if they feel like it? They have such mental and physical prowess that you can't help but admire them. They're quite literally trained to beat the human emotions out of them, and hence they're always referred as being cold and witch-like. A mantra from the Bene Gesserit training manual from the world of Dune states, "I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain." They can detect lies and manipulate people through subtle cues. They're basically human lie detectors and master persuaders. By modulating their tone, a Bene Gesserit can command others to obey without question, kind of like a Jedi mind trick, but way scarier and rooted in tone and psychological dominance. After undergoing the Water of Life ritual, a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother gains access to the lives and memories of all her female ancestors, thousands of lives in one mind. But I guess the main criticism of sexism comes from the fact that they're not very overt, they're not very direct. They're not directly in power. They're always counsels and assisting people, but they don't have this very tangible power. But again, that is the purpose. They don't need titles. They have influence, which is much harder to detect and remove. The Bene Gesserit want to guide humanity subtly, avoiding extinction, collapse, or unchecked chaos. They believe in long-term planning over brute force. While the Empire, Guild, and great houses use power openly, the Bene Gesserit use influence and foresight, often staying in the shadows. And not gonna lie, guys, they're not exactly saints. They lie, manipulate, and scheme. But even so, they do it with a sense of moral duty. They weaponize knowledge, not just brute force. They're scientists, philosophers, warriors, and spies all in one. If they want to use brute force, they absolutely can, in the way that Lady Jessica did when she overpowered Stilgar in a fight. They don't need to prove themselves. A Reverend Mother can walk into a room and terrify the most powerful emperor with just a glance. With all of this explained, do you still think that the Bene Gesserit are no more than a sexist trope? I do understand the criticisms because the Bene Gesserit are basically the result of like a 1,000-year-long breeding program. And I can see why people perceive eugenics to be bad. But even with all this explanation, the Bene Gesserit are still not a girl power feminist fantasy. They're morally ambiguous, just like any powerful institution, and their complexity is what makes them so rich and human. While I've talked about a lot of the controversies and the tension points in Dune, there are still some things that you simply can't ignore. The very vivid world building, from the setting to the description of the technologies, to the history, to the culture of Arrakis, and the Imperium with all its details. Dune feels tangibly real. It portrays a future where humans have become so unrecognizable that they have essentially become the aliens. From the clothing and apparel of the Fremen to their culture and their customs, everything is in line with the desert culture and water scarcity. I personally really like the scene where Stilgar spits in front of Duke Leto, but in Fremen culture, this is actually interpreted as a sign of great respect, as offering the moisture of your body, aka your spit, is so valuable in such a water-scarce planet. Similarly, the Fremen almost never cry, as they similarly believe that shedding tears, hence your body's moisture, is inherently wasteful. Little things like this give a lot of life to the Fremen and the culture of Arrakis, making these characters and these cultures come to life. Even with all the controversies surrounding the book, the author, and the movies, we still can't deny that Dune is an immaculately written and rich book that has a lot to offer from culture, customs, ecological themes, philosophy, societal critique, and much more. Dune isn't just a sci-fi epic. It's a dense, brilliant warning about the dangers of blind faith, charismatic leaders, religious manipulation, and colonialism, and environmental collapse. It's a powerful exploration of power and identity, and how good intentions can spiral into horror, even when they carried out by so-called heroes. Dune gives us a rich world that reflects the worst and most fascinating parts of our own history. And yes, while there are valid criticisms, including casting choices and cultural representation, the story itself invites us to ask uncomfortable questions, not just about its characters, but about ourselves. So whether you love Dune, hate it, still think it's a white savior story, or still trying to figure out what spice melange tastes like, I hope this video offered some depth and helped you look at it through a different lens. Wait a second. This is just as the prophecies foretold. It was written that you would fly to this table. One day, Mojo is the chosen Messiah that will lead us to freedom. The prophecies have always foretold that he would love playing with the specific, particular crochet bee. The prophecies knew he would like to attack it in his free time. The prophecies also foretold that he would like playing with plant pots, and he would throw them around. As it was written,